want to introduce our speakers tonight. So first off, we have Sabra Ibrahim from the Climate Emergency Unit, which is a project of the David Suzuki Foundation. And Sabra will speak to us for a few minutes about the national work of the Climate Emergency Unit and this idea of what does it mean for our governments at all levels to act like it's the climate emergency they say it is. And following Saba's presentation, we'll have a panel discussion with some local folks as well.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. So before I begin, I'm coming to you from Treaty 13 territory, also known as Toronto. This land has been the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and a home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I am the Ontario organizer for the Climate Emergency Unit, and as our name suggests, our goal is to move Canada and its people into emergency mode in the fight against the climate crisis. So what do we mean by emergency mode? Well, it's no longer news to anyone that we're staring down the barrel of a climate crisis, and as we've said, Canada has now acknowledged that a crisis exists. They've declared emergency, but when it comes to matching those words with actions, I'm going to be very blunt here, they failed. And if we don't act quickly and decisively, we will very soon, sooner than many of us want to imagine, be living in a world that is in fact unlivable for many of us and dangerous, difficult, and disruptive for many others. The CEU's work is inspired and guided by a book that our team leader, Seth Klein, put out in the fall of 2020, which is called A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. In essence, we believe that the only way that Canada can meet this climate emergency successfully is if it responds in the way it did to another massive existential threat, which was the Second World War. So as Seth says in this book, the Second World War is proof that we have done this before. Canada has mobilized in huge numbers across class and race and gender and put into motion a series of transformative acts that got Canada through the war. Canada recognized that World War II was an emergency, that it threatened the very existence of the country, and it was a fight that had to be won because if there was no victory, then nothing else would matter. And the climate crisis is the same exactly. If we don't win this war, nothing else will matter. And this is where emergency mode comes in. Canada needs to be in emergency mode if we're to win this war, this good war. And Seth's book set out what we now call markers of emergency, the things a government must do to really truly be in emergency mode. And these markers were originally written for all levels of government, but you can use them anywhere. You can apply them to any large institution, any large entity or organization. So the markers are these. Number one, spend what it takes to win. Number two, create new institutions to get the job done. Number three, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. Number four, tell the truth about the severity of the crisis and everything else, ideally, and convey a sense of real emergency. Number five, leave no one behind. And number six, Indigenous leadership and rights are essential to winning. Now, during the war, Canada's government hit markers 1 to 4 in a big way. They got some way towards meeting marker 5, but it's a sad and uncomfortable truth that many were left behind. And with regards to marker 6, I would encourage everyone listening to me today to seek out sources that are more appropriate than I to learn about Canada's perspective on Indigenous leadership and rights during the time of the war. And as far as the climate emergency goes, so far, neither the federal nor provincial nor any government of any political stripe has hit any of these markers, and that cannot continue. And that brings us to today's theme. What does it look like for cities to act like it's a climate emergency? So I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on some of our markers and talk a bit about what they might mean for cities or how they could play out on a municipal level. So marker 1, spend what it takes to win. We know our governments can do this because they've done it before. And recently they did it to a certain extent in the pandemic response. When governments recognize an emergency, the money is always there. But the current government is not spending what it takes to win against the climate crisis. The Trudeau government is spending, at a conservative estimate, about 10 times less than what is necessary. And a lot of that money should be going directly to municipalities, to cities for climate-related infrastructure. Now, having said that, a lot of municipal spending isn't meeting this marker either. The questions that need to be front and center are we spending what we should on climate emergency measures? Is emergency mode reflected in capital spending, on buildings, on transit? And since there needs to be money to spend, it's just as important to stop spending on things that are going to make the situation worse and wipe out any progress that's made elsewhere. And it means subsidizing fossil fuels and stop investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure. For municipal funds, this means divesting your holdings from fossil fuel companies because, make no mistake, apart from anything else, if funds and staff pensions and endowments continue to be invested in fossil fuels, they will be at risk. At legal risk, because more and more court cases are stacking up against fossil fuel companies to hold them responsible and accountable for their role in climate denial, climate delay, destruction, and human rights violations. But also financial risk, because these companies, their reserves and their hard assets are going to become stranded. To continue to invest in fossil fuel companies is to stake your future returns against the survival of future generations. And I'm saying that without an ounce of hyperbole. Marker 2, create new institutions to get the job done. Again, we've done this before. The Canadian government established no less than 28 crown corporations to meet the supply and munitions requirements of the war effort. Now, in response to the climate emergency, there's been nothing remotely approaching this. A government that recognizes the climate emergency as an emergency would establish an entirely new generation of public corporations to make sure the things we need, from heat pumps to solar arrays to electric buses, it's a long, long list. Those things are being produced and deployed at the necessary scale. And a lot of these entities should be municipal. They should be neighborhood energy utilities. They should be retrofit agencies, entities to mass install things like heat pumps and rooftop solar, or even a housing agency, which builds affordable housing that's also zero carbon. That's a tiny, tiny number of examples. There are so many possibilities. Number 3, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. Now, for the last 20 years, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions should have been declining. They have instead flatlined. Now, a major reason is that whatever we've done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions has been almost entirely voluntary. We're encouraging change. We're offering rebates. We're sending price signals, but we're not requiring change. And unfortunately, this is also true for a lot of municipal climate policies. And if we're going to meet the GHG targets that we have to meet, it's necessary to set clear near-term dates by which certain things are going to be required. So declaring that it's no longer legal to sell fossil fuel burning vehicles as of 2025. Changing building codes, making sure that all new buildings are not going to be permitted to tie into natural gas lines or use other fossil fuels for heating. And it means saying no to sprawl and highway expansion and saying no to fossil fuel expansion plans, things like that. Marker 4 is on the surface of it, a very simple one. It shouldn't even need saying. It's tell the truth. But when governments aren't in emergency mode, they have messaging that's vague, it's obfuscating, it's contradictory. Leaders need to act and speak like the climate crisis is an emergency, and they're not doing that. Point 5, leave no one behind. So this in part means being sure to include those who are the most vulnerable and the most severely affected by the climate crisis. And these people are very often forgotten or deliberately excluded from support. But it also means ensuring a just transition for people whose economic and employment security is tied to the fossil fuel economy right now. And that ties back to our very first marker. When we spend what we should, we can undoubtedly create more jobs than we'll be losing. So my final word is going to be on marker 6, Indigenous leadership. Right and title are central to winning. Canada has spent years, generations, systematically abusing and violating Indigenous rights and title. And only recently has some national attention come to some of the more egregious of those abuses. But over and over again, it is Indigenous communities asserting Indigenous title and rights that is showing us the way forward. Slowing and blocking new fossil fuel projects and showing the kind of leadership that's been glaringly absent elsewhere. So thank you for your patience, and I'm really excited to hear the rest of tonight's speakers. I welcome feedback and questions at the Q&A section at the end of this talk. And if you'd like to get in touch later, if anything that I've said has inspired you or made you want to talk to me, I will drop my email address in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saba, for your wonderful words. Framing Canada's response to the climate emergency, these 6 markers of spending what it takes to win, telling the truth, mandatory measures, and creating the institutions, as well as leaving no one behind and respecting Indigenous leadership. These are 6 markers as a nation, which show that we are actually acting like the emergency we're declaring that it is. And clearly, some of these have a lot of application to city contexts. So today we're going to invite, first of all, Debbie Chapman, who's a City of Kitchener councillor in Ward 9, to reflect on what it would look like for the City of Kitchener to act like it's the climate emergency they say it is. So welcome, Debbie.
Hello. Hello. I feel like I've got 2 audiences here. Well, I'm no expert in this stuff, but I'll do my best to try to give an overview of what the city does or doesn't do. I wanted to start with a quote from an article called Sweltering Cities that was published on the CBC, by the CBC on July 13th, 2022. And the author is Jayla Bernstein. And I've chosen this one because it resonates with me as a downtown city councillor. Picture yourself walking through the downtown core of a city on a hot day in July. Heat radiates from the asphalt. Rows of tall buildings stop the breeze from reaching you. There are no trees in sight, only blocks of concrete, steel, and sweltering heat. Extreme heat caused by climate change is already killing Canadians, and it's going to get worse. The warming planet means heat waves will be more intense and more frequent than before. As I said, this resonates with me as a downtown city councillor as we build more and more high rises. 73.7% of all Canadians live in cities, which are susceptible to what is called the urban heat island effect, where temperatures in urban centers can be up to 12 degrees higher than rural areas in the same sort of location. It's been demonstrated over and over again, and I think Saba made reference to this, that the poorest and most vulnerable, they have less access to such things as healthy, affordable food and affordable housing. Barcelona's 2018 climate plan included a focus on addressing economic and social inequality, while also addressing climate mitigation and adaptation. It recognized that those most impacted by climate change were often not part of the decision-making process. The plan had action items and has action items designed to improving living conditions, preventing things like gas, water, and electricity from being cut off, and preventing harm from excessive heat to population. They also created what they called super blocks, which prioritized the movement of people over vehicles, similar to our active transportation model here in Kitchener. And it enhanced tree canopies and installed more park benches, just to name a few of the things that they did in these super blocks to create an atmosphere that was more welcoming, improve the quality of air, but also served as a social community enhancement of living conditions. Change will reduce greenhouse gases, but will also address issues such as social inequalities, food sovereignty, and adequate housing. The City of Kitchener adopted a corporate climate action plan in 2019. This was after declaring a climate emergency that same year. It's a plan for the corporation of the City of Kitchener to improve its facilities and the vehicles that it uses, and how they're run, etc. So some of the goals of the plan are, and I won't go through all of them, but some of them are to maximize facility level efficiencies and resilience. And I'm quoting directly from the plan. Optimize and innovate city fleet through technology, alternative fuels, and electrification. Upgrade and standardize outdoor lighting to LED technology. And through the implementation of these measures, its goal is to, quote, reduce corporate greenhouse gas emissions and promote inclusive environmental sustainability and resilience, end of quote. At the corporate level, according to the update we got in 2020, the corporation has implemented important changes to city vehicles, lighting upgrades, city facilities. It's diverted hundreds of tons of waste from the landfill, and it's grown the downtown cycling grid and increased its tree canopy. And I won't go into the details of how much or by how much of each of those things changed. But that's the sort of report that we received. Subsequently, it adopted the Waterloo Regional Community Climate Action Plan. And maybe some of you are familiar with this action plan. Things such as by 2050, most trips will be taken using active transportation. By 2050, remaining personal and commercial vehicles will be zero-emission vehicles. So again, those are excerpts right out of the Community Action Plan for Waterloo Region. So in the course of adopting this plan, Kitchener also committed to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030, as did the other municipalities in the region. So which puts pressure on all of us to act quickly. While I don't have an update on how we're doing at the community level, I wanted to start with a concern that I have with the way we measure greenhouse gas emissions. So my biggest concern is that we talk about greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but we do not have a clear idea of the greenhouse gases we produce. So for example, how much greenhouse gas is produced through the manufacturing of the materials we use in the construction of new buildings? How much greenhouse gas is produced to transport the food we consume and the material we import for construction and basic living needs, such as the clothes we wear? Do we know how much greenhouse gas is produced at the community level? I would say not. And I think that without this important figure, it's difficult to celebrate the reductions that are recorded. So we talk about reductions, but we don't even know what we emit. So there's never a sort of a balance sheet of what that looks like. So now turn for a moment to the concerns, set aside the concerns that I have, and think about ways municipalities can increase their reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And many of the items that I'm going to touch on are related to development, again, because I'm a downtown ward councillor, and many of which we actually don't have authority to implement or to require, but I think that we should be able to require them. It would require amendments to the Planning Act, because as you probably know, we fall under the jurisdiction of the province. And the Planning Act is what gives us the tools to make these changes. And I'm not trying to give excuses to the municipalities, because I understand in Ontario, there are municipalities that are going beyond the Planning Act and introducing some of these changes. Keeping in mind at the same time that the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions are transportation, buildings, and agriculture. So I would like to see the city require green roofs on all new buildings, and by that I don't mean painting the roof green. I mean, having trees and plants, vegetation on all rooftops of new buildings. Another thing is that cities should be doing is promoting and encouraging retrofitting, and I think Saba made reference to this as well. So rather than demolition and rebuilding, which is the way we go about doing development, we should be focusing more on encouraging retrofitting. I also think that cities should require that all new developments have EV chargers in every new parking spot. To retrofit EV chargers in all existing buildings would be a pretty tall order, but there's no reason why from here on we couldn't be requiring it in all new builds. We talk a lot about net zero ready buildings, and we celebrate that. But I think we have to go beyond that and talk about net zero buildings, where everything that's consumed in that building is produced on site. The whole net zero ready idea, I know the YWCA building on Blockline is net zero ready, and which is great. I mean, it doesn't go far enough because it could never become a net zero building unless somebody invests the money and takes it to that next stage. Been in contact with a local plant-based organization and already started conversations with cities increasing plant-based food options at city-run events and facilities and meetings. Some may think it's a trivial, irrelevant step, but I think methane gas is, as we know, is a serious problem when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. Another thing that this city can do to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, like keeping building heights at 6 to 8 stories. In theory, we talk about this, but we don't do it. Reducing the proportion of glass to concrete in new buildings. Glass, the emission heat is greater. Creating more green spaces and parks in areas, especially in the downtown with increased densification got here. The city has its a plan called Places and Spaces. They've gone through the work of deciding the spaces part of it, although it's incomplete. Spaces referring to parks themselves, places being the things that we have in the park. So whether it be a kid's playground or a dog park or whatever, those are the places, the spaces are the parks themselves. So the spaces part of the report is completed, although what it's missing are defining those spaces. So the report shows that the greatest need for parkland is in the downtown core, yet no lands have been designated as future parklands or green spaces. Another thing that the city should be doing are requiring LEED certified components in all new buildings. And I'm not even saying at this stage, make them LEED certified, although I think they should be, but at least get to the point of starting to talk about, you know, these are some components that every building should have. Increasing funding for local food production. And when I say that, I think of things like more community gardens. There are quite a few in Kitchener. I don't know about the other cities in the region, but there are quite a few, mostly led by community neighborhood associations. But to my knowledge, we have no winterized community gardens. And again, if we're serious about producing our food locally, which would reduce the transportation of food and produce from other parts of the world, then we've got to start thinking about winterized community gardens. And when I say this, I again think food sovereignty, where people have the resources to produce what they eat. So it's not just having enough food in the world to feed all the people, but that we actually produce our own food. Alternative renewable energy sources, of course, there's a talk of district energy plant at the corner of King and Victoria. And it's being talked about, it hasn't yet been started. I would think I've brought to council the importance that it be biomass generated and not fossil fuel generated. In the end, I mean, we haven't gotten to the stage of anything happening, but I would imagine it might be a hybrid. Also solar, thermal heat pumps are as alternative sources of energy as well. Geothermal is an interesting one because we'll get reports from the city saying, you know, from the region, from all the different bodies that look at new developments that are about to be built in the city. And I saw a line on one recently that said, geothermal is feasible on this build. Yet there's no requirement that the developer use geothermal in that build. A lot of them will say it's not feasible because of the ground won't permit it. But even where it is permitted and it is feasible, we don't require it. I think it's important that cities continue working with local climate justice organizations like Divest Waterloo, 50 by 30, etc. The other thing I wanted to say is a call out to the private sector. And I would invite them to find ways to manufacture more locally, to boost the economy, but also to reduce greenhouse gas emissions caused by transporting of goods. And Samir Amin, if you've ever heard of him, a philosopher, refers to this as delinking. And that is delinking from the global market. I mean, it can be used in different ways, but delinking from the global market and producing locally is sort of what's behind his analysis. So in conclusion, I want to highlight, this is one of my favorite books, What Every Environmentalist Needs to Know About Capitalism. I want to highlight an overarching analysis that they make where they state that capitalism recognizes no limits to its self-expansion. There is no amount of profit, no amount of wealth, and no amount of consumption that is either enough or too much. This means that the environment exists not as a place with inherent boundaries within which human beings must live together with Earth's other species, but as a realm to be exploited in a process of growing economic expansion. In this context, that I think it's important for local governments to realize that capitalism causes environmental and social damage in the very way it functions. I'm not trying to sound defeatist, but rather to acknowledge that it's a difficult task to reach our goals in a meaningful way that will benefit society long-term. And that we need to do better, and we can do better, but we need to act quicker. That's it.
Thank you. This question is for everyone here at the Commons and everyone at home too, to think about. Debbie will have her own answer. If you imagine a scale between 1 to 10, 10 being, oh, our city is acting like the emergency they say it is, and 1 being saying it's an emergency, but they're not acting on it. If you were to rate the city of Toronto on that 1 to 10 scale of whether we're acting like the emergency we say it is, what number about it?
Good question. I wouldn't give it any higher than a 5. We're already in 2022. We have 8 years to reduce greenhouse gases by 50%, but I don't know if I could rate it any higher than a 5.
All of you at home, question in the chat, so you have access to that during our small group conversation. So as I think about a building that's on fire, it's pretty obvious that people are taking the emergency seriously when they're heading for the exit. You had a lot of really important things cities can do to, act like it's an emergency. But I'm wondering for all of us, if we're just going around our daily lives, what are 3 things that we should look for from the city that indicates that the city is taking the emergency seriously?
What are the 3 things that we should be looking for?
And no need for a perfect answer. But from your own perspective, from what you're passionate about and your experience on city council.
Well, I mean, again, coming from a Ward 9 perspective in downtown, one of my biggest concerns is the fact that we don't have an updated plan on downtown development. We're working from a zoning bylaw from 1985, and that for me is very problematic because we need to be able to have a vision of what we want downtown to look like. Are they going to be 6 and 8 stories? It's going to be a mix of different heights around the city. And height isn't the only issue. It is what types of energy are we using to heat and to cool these buildings? The other thing, from a climate justice perspective, who's being left behind? Oftentimes when we build new buildings, as I mentioned earlier, it's demolition and rebuild. Well, behind every demolition, we usually have evictions, right? And so people are left with scrambling to find alternative places to live. And I think it's important that people, in the community be aware of this. And maybe we have to push harder to ensure that, if there is going to be an eviction, that person has an alternative living arrangement made through the developer and the city working jointly. I'm not one to put the onus on individuals within society. I think there are systemic changes that need to happen to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And by systemic, I hold corporations, the private sector, the public sector, all responsible for that. And certainly, the way responsibilities are distributed, the region is in charge of certain things that we have no say in, like public transportation. I can't speak to that because I'm not at that table. Things like waste management, again, that's a regional issue, it's not a city issue. But there are things that, I guess what I would ask people to do is to approach your elected officials when you see things that could be done differently and speak to us, say, have you thought of this? And, how can we work on it together? And I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I would ask of people.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay.
This going back and forth with the camera is sort of it's interesting. So I'll just repeat the questions that I just asked Debbie, just for everyone here on Zoom and everyone here in person. So the first question I asked is, on a scale of 1 to 10, are we acting like the emergency we say it is? And I would encourage each of you here on Zoom and each of you here in person to think about, where would you put the city on that scale, either the city of Kitchener or the region of Waterloo? And the second question is, what easy to see signs would you use to indicate to yourself whether the cities are acting like the emergency they say it is? So I'm just going to reread Seth Klein's list which is again on a national level, but it can be helpful as we think about this. So Seth, from his book, had these 4 signs. A government that is acting like an emergency it says it is, spends what it needs to take to win, creates new economic institutions to get the job done, shifts from voluntary measures to mandatory measures, and then tells the truth about the severity of the crisis. And Saba tonight also added, it leaves no one behind. And number 6, it takes Indigenous leadership and respects Indigenous titles. So what we're going to do now for the next 20 minutes or so, both here in person and on Zoom, we're going to gather in small groups just to talk about these ideas. Well, welcome back, everyone. We hope those of you who are in small groups in the breakout rooms had a fruitful discussion. We had a large group discussion here. So we have questions both for Debbie and for Saba. And what I would invite is whoever from each of your breakout rooms, if you can send your questions to me on the chat. We'll actually start with a question that came from our in-person group, and this is for Saba. Saba, you mentioned Seth Klein's 6 markers of a climate emergency, and we're wondering, do you have concrete examples of cities within Canada that have implemented one of those markers, whether it's tell the truth, create mandatory measures, that kind of thing? One example or multiple examples that you can share with us as a group?
That is a good question. Sorry, I'm checking my own notes because I don't trust my own memory about this. So in response to the question, the city that comes to mind first and foremost, I think, is Vancouver. And Vancouver is Seth's city, so it's no surprise that that's top of mind for him. But so in terms of mandates, Vancouver has mandated that no new buildings are going to be permitted to tie into fossil fuel or gas lines, and I think that's as early as of next year. So that's a really good example for a strong, decisive, very clearly defined mandate that is going to have measurable change. And I think also Vancouver also now has a real climate emergency plan. And I don't know the details because I, of course, don't live in Vancouver. But as far as I know, it meets several of Seth's markers, I believe at least 4. So in terms of meeting the markers, there are certainly cities that are doing it, and it's also happening on sort of a smaller scale than is perhaps necessary at neighborhood level sometimes. And all of that means is that it's very obvious that it can be expanded to a city level or a province level. Vancouver's the first example that comes to mind. But and I can't remember where, but Quebec is saying no to fossil fuel expansion plans. That's another good example. Those are the 2 that come to mind right off the top of my head.
And then the second question was related to the speed that we need to respond to the climate emergency and also the need for democratic participation. So democracy.
The democracy and emergency question is an interesting one, because on one level, I feel that it's a little bit of a straw man argument. There's no real reason that the democratic process should not take place at a rate that matches up with us being emergency mode. That's just the way that it has been. But as with a lot of things that have been the norm, because it's taken a long time in the past does not necessarily mean that it should in the future. And I will be the first to say that I don't have an ironclad point-by-point action plan for how that might happen. But I do certainly think that it's possible to go through a consultation process and make sure that the people who are going to be affected by any kind of mandates or drastic changes that are going to help the climate emergency movement are understanding the implications of that and sort of approving of it happening to them. On one level, I don't think that it's really as much of an obstacle as maybe it seems to be.
Thank you. That is certainly my hope as well.